Aloha and welcome to Botany 101. I'm Angela Nishimoto. For today's lesson, we're going to do tissues, roots, and soils. Okay, first of all, tissues. Okay, tissues comprise organs. They make up the organs. And of course, the organs of the plant are the roots, the stems, and the leaves, and the flowers. Okay. And what are tissues? Tissues are groups of cells that perform a common function, such as this illustration here show you a cross-section of leaf tissue or blade tissue, petiole tissue, stem tissue, and root tissues. Okay? So one of those kind of tissues we're going to cover are the meristems. Meristems are regions of active cell division, okay? And there are two types of meristems. First of all, we have apical meristems that are at the tips of roots and shoots, okay? So here's an illustration with the terminal bud, and the meristem is in here somewhere, right? And apical meristems are in the tips of roots and shoots, and they provide for an increase in length of the plant, okay? They're responsible for primary growth, right? So apical meristems are one type of meristem, okay? The other type of meristem is called a lateral meristem. Lateral means side to side. So these are cylinders of tissue within the plant, especially woody plants, and they allow for an increase in girth, okay? So lateral meristems, okay, allow for secondary growth. Okay, so here we have the cork cambium. Here we have the vascular cambium. Okay, and the vascular cambium actually allows for tissues that grow, that provide support and conduction. Okay, so the vascular cambium is responsible for the growth of secondary xylem toward the inside and secondary phloem toward the outside. Okay, and then we also have the cork cambium, which is responsible for the growth of bark. So here, the cork cambium right under the bark, which is also known as periderm, okay, which is also known as cork. Okay. Now, other kinds of meristems include intercalary meristems, okay? These are meristems of grasses, right? What they do is they allow grazers to graze on the grass and kind of rip it up and still allow the grasses to come back and grow, okay? And grazers actually, even though some people had the mistaken thought that grazers actually led to the destruction of grasslands, grazers are actually necessary for grasslands to survive, okay? Now we're going to talk about simple tissues, okay? And simple tissues are made of one type of cell, okay? And among these are the parenchyma cells, parenchyma tissue, okay? So parenchyma tissue is the most abundant of cell types. Okay, they tend to have large vacuoles when they're mature that hold starch grains and oils, tannins and crystals, etc. Okay, and as you can see from this photograph, they're thin-walled cells. They're often circular when they're first produced, when they first, after the result of cell division. Remember mitosis and cell division, cytokinesis, that we talked about before? Okay, so they're thin-walled when they first become, and then what they'll do is they'll actually press up against other cells as they grow and become, in some cases, 14-sided. Okay, another kind of simple tissue is a collenchyma. Okay, collenchyma generally is just beneath the epidermis of the plant. Okay, and these collenchyma cells have uneven thicknesses. So here's the lumen of the cell, and these are the cell walls, and the cell walls have uneven thickness because of the way the cell grows. Okay, so both parenchyma and collenchyma are the result of primary growth. Okay, and collenchyma allows for flexible support. A good example of collenchyma are the strings in celery. Okay. Now we also have sclerenchyma. Okay, sclerenchyma generally are mostly dead at maturity, and they have secondary cell walls. Okay, that are impregnated with lignin. Remember we talked about the rebar of cellulose in a concrete of lignin. Okay, so the rebar is like in concrete, and the cellulose fibrils is in lignin in secondary cell walls. So these cells that you see here actually lend support, okay, strong support to the cell. Okay, and these cells are what they call sclerides. You can see the thick secondary walls of these sclerides. All right. Now sclerides are what they call stone cells. They're kind of hard and gritty. In fact, stone cells are responsible for the gritty feel when you eat a pear. It has a kind of grit, a little like sandy kind of texture to it. Those come from sclerides. Okay, also the shells of nuts are also from sclerides. The hardness of the shells of nuts and the hardness of the pits of peaches and plums actually comes from sclerides. Okay. Another kind of sclerenchyma are fiber cells. Okay, fiber cells tend to be longer than they are wide, and humans have used them for textiles and cordage for thousands of years. An example of a fiber is the fiber of nettles. It can be 8 inches long, so the fiber cell can be 8 inches long. Okay. Now we have complex tissues, and complex tissues are of 2 or more types of cells, okay, mostly produced by woody plants that have wood, okay. And one kind of complex tissue is xylem tissue. Xylem conducts water and dissolved minerals in the plant. It conducts water from the root into the stem, into the leaf, and out of the leaf through pores called stomates. And some of the components of xylem include parenchyma cells, fiber cells, ray cells, which are a kind of parenchyma, okay, that actually make up rays. And then you have specialized cells that conduct water and minerals, such as tracheids, which are these more slender cells. Tracheids are connected end to end. Okay, they're like pipes. And so are vessels, or vessel elements. Okay, they're like pipes in the plant that conduct water. They're dead when mature. Okay. So these sclerenchyma cells, such as xylem, actually are dead when mature. Now phloem. Phloem is a food-conducting tissue in the plant, usually conducting it in the form of sugars. Okay, and most of these sugars, of course, come from photosynthesis. Phloem is made of, conducts food, and is made up of parenchyma cells, fiber cells, ray cells, sieve tube members, which are live when mature. Okay, whereas remember the vessel elements in the xylem is dead when mature. Okay, and they have no nuclei, but next to each sieve tube member is a smaller companion cell. They call them companion cells because they're like a companion to the larger sieve tube member. Okay, companion cells have large nuclei. Okay, and they're closely associated with sieve tube members, and they're also associated with the conduction of food. Okay. Now the epidermis is the outermost layer of the plant. Okay, it's usually 1 cell thick. Okay, but orchids have roots with velamen on them. Okay, which may be several cells thick. Okay, And in this outermost layer, you remember cutin that we talked about when we were talking about waxes? Cutin and waxes are within the outer surface of the epidermis. Okay, and this forms a cuticle which reduces evaporation, keeps the plant from losing too much water, and also resists bacterial incursions. Okay, now on the roots, okay, on the roots you have root hairs. We'll go into that in a little bit. Okay, and on the above ground parts, on the stem sometimes, and sometimes on the leaf, you have hairs, also known as trichomes. So here are trichomes on the epidermis of this plant section here. Okay, now the leaves have stomata with guard cells. Okay, we can't really see that in this picture here, but we'll see them later on in our lectures. Okay, now the periderm, okay, occurs in woody plants. All right, in woody plants it replaces the epidermis because the epidermis is sloughed off as the plant grows more and more in girth or in wideness, okay, or in width, okay. And this periderm comes from the cork cambium. Remember we talked about that as a secondary meristem. Okay, so we have the cork cambium here, okay, making cork cells. Okay, and these cork cells are impregnated with suberin, okay, which waterproofs the cell and also serves to protect the cell, okay, from any kind of insect incursion or anything. Now remember Robert Hooke? Okay, remember Robert Hooke? We talked about Robert Hooke before. What did he do? Do you remember what he did that was so important? Think about it in a minute. Okay, he was the first to actually observe cells by taking some slices of cork oak, looking at it under a so-called primitive microscope. Okay, so he actually called these cells cells. Remember that from a lecture or so ago? Okay. Now we also have lenticels that serve as gas exchange. Lenticels usually are made of loosely arranged parenchyma, and lenticels are generally located at the edges of the ridges in the bark or on the epidermis of certain parts of plants, like on apples. The little brown dots that you see on apples, like red delicious apples, are actually lenticels. Okay. Now we have secretory cells and tissues. Okay, they actually secrete waste products for one thing, and they secrete nectar, okay, in the flower, and also essential oils such as citrus and mint. Remember that this comes from the Golgi apparatus. Okay, perfumes. Hormones are also secreted by secretory cells and tissues. Then we have mucilage. We have the glandular hair that are secreted by glandular hairs on things like this. Sundew, which is a carnivorous plant. Okay. And latex, this whitish substance here. Latex, you know, if you actually get a poinsettia plant or other members of the family and you damage it, what comes out is this latex, this white latex. Okay, so that's from members of the spurge family or the Euphorbiaceae. And then you have resins that come from conifers. Okay, and resins will fossilize to become amber. Yeah, lovely, lovely amber. Okay, the next subject we're going to get into are the roots. Okay, now roots anchor the plant. Okay, so here you can see some little plants with their two cotyledons, okay, two seed leaves, and you have the roots anchoring them in soil. Okay, now some water plants such as water lettuce and water hyacinth will actually have their roots in water. Okay, and then epiphytes. Epiphytes are plants that grow on other plants. Epi means upon, and phyte refers to plants, P-H-Y-T-E. So epiphytes are plants that grow on other plants, and epiphytes use their roots to actually crawl along the bark and along the branches to keep themselves up on trees and other structures, such even on rocks. Okay. Now another thing about epiphytes is, why do they actually do that? Why do they live on trees? Think about it. Because most of them live in the tropical forest, and in tropical forest the competition is for light. It's not for water. So the epiphytes actually grow way up in the treetops so they can get exposure to light. Okay. Now most plants though are anchored in soils. Okay. Another function of roots are to absorb water and minerals. Okay, so roots anchor the plant and they absorb water and minerals. Those are the two main functions of a root in a plant. Okay, secondary functions include the storage of water or food, and also they do reproduction in some cases. Okay, we'll go into that in a little bit. Okay. Now development. Okay, the radicle here is the embryonic root in the plant embryo. This one here is a cotyledon, one of the two cotyledons that will open up when the radicle grows into the root. Okay, so the radicle develops into a root, and in some cases they'll develop into the taproot of dicots. Okay. Dicotyledony, that actually comes from two cotyledons, right? So we have this taproot system, okay, that grows in the dicots when the dicots develop from seeds. And then we have the monocotyledony, okay, that have one cotyledon. And monocots tend to have a fibrous root system, okay? So taproots, dicots. Fibrous roots, monocots. Okay? And then we have adventitious roots. All right? Adventitious roots are roots that develop from places where you don't expect roots to come from. Okay, such as a stem. Okay? So what we're going to do now is we're going to go over to the plants here to show you some roots. Okay? So here we have neruri, which is a little worse for wear, being in this dry studio environment. But here you see it has one main root with smaller roots coming off of it. You might even be able to see that on some parts of this root there's still a little dirt, even though I rinsed it off, because the root hairs will actually cling to soil particles. Okay, so this main root is called a taproot. And then you have secondary roots coming off the taproot. Okay, so a taproot is indicative of a dicot when the dicot develops from seeds like this neruri did. Okay, now this plant here is some kind of a sedge. Okay, it looks like nutweed, nutgrass, right? And this here has fibrous roots. You see the roots are all about the same size and there are many of them. Okay, so these are fibrous roots of a monocot. Okay, in this case, nutgrass or nutweed. Okay, so generally you have dicots that have taproot systems and you have monocots that have fibrous root systems. That's a dichotomy. Okay, taproots, dicots, fibrous roots, monocots. Okay, now coming back to these plants. Here on this nice pothos plants, we have an example of an adventitious root. Remember, adventitious roots are roots that develop from places you don't expect the root to develop, like along a stem. Okay, and here you have an adventitious roots growing from the stem of pothos. Okay, so what we're going to do now is going to go back to the computer. Okay, so here we are again. Okay, now in terms of root anatomy, there are 4 root parts of the root cap. Okay, the root tip, I'm sorry. Okay, the first part is the root cap, right? So here we have the root cap of this root, okay, made up of larger cells, and the root cap's job, okay, is to actually protect the growing point behind it, the very delicate growing meristem point behind it. Because remember, meristems, apical meristems, are at tips of shoots and at the tips of roots. Okay, so the root needs a root cap to protect the dividing cells, because the root will actually push through the soil, which is sharp. Actually, the particles are sharp and very abrasive. Okay, so the root cap does get worn away. Okay, so it protects the growing tip of the root. Okay, another thing it does is that it can perceive gravity. Okay, there are amyloplasts, okay, in the root cap that will actually orient itself according to where gravity is. So if you're growing a plant with the roots going downwards, okay, and then you tip it on its side, in just about half an hour to a few hours, the roots will start growing toward gravity again, because the amyloplasts will have tumbled to the bottom part that's facing gravity, and then made the root go down again. Okay, so they perceive gravity. Okay. Okay, now the region of cell division. Okay, that's the region where you have the meristem. Okay, the apical meristem. This here is actually a stem, not a root, but the apical meristem is at the tip of shoots as well. Okay, and that is what they call the region of cell division. Okay, it produces the root cap in the root. Okay, so the apical meristem also produces the protoderm, which becomes the epidermis. It also produces the ground meristem that becomes the cortex. Okay, the cortical cells tend to mostly store food. Okay, and the procambium, which is the primary vascular tissue. So the apical meristem produces all 3: the protoderm that becomes the epidermis, the ground meristem that becomes the cortex, and the procambium, which becomes the primary vascular tissue, the primary xylem and the primary florum. Okay. Now the region of elongation. Okay, the region of elongation, here, cells get longer, much longer, and they get wider and they expand. Okay, while they're doing that, the tiny vacuoles, there may be several vacuoles in a small cell that has just divided, but the tiny vacuoles will fuse and merge and become 1 or 2 vacuoles that make up 90% or more of the cell. Okay. Then you have the region of maturation. Okay, the region of maturation is an area where the cells start to differentiate. Okay, like in epidermal cells, into ground tissue, into vascular tissues. Okay, and that's also an area where you have the root hairs. So root hairs are a single-celled extension of epidermal cells, like you see on this diagram too. The root hairs, it greatly increases the surface area of the root. Okay, and the root hairs will actually absorb water and mineral nutrients. Okay, they also tend to adhere to soil particles and greatly increase the surface area. Okay, now the cortex. Okay, cortical cells are parenchyma cells that mainly store food. Okay, and then the innermost part of the cortex is called the endodermis. Okay, the endodermis actually is impregnated with suberin that forms something called the Casparian strip. Okay. Now then you have the vascular cylinder. Okay, let's see. And generally here we have the pericycle. The pericycle is the layer of cells just under the or inside the endodermis. Okay, and the pericycle is responsible for the growth of branch roots and also the vascular cambium of dicots. Okay, so here you see sort of like a three-dimensional view of a dicot root, and here you can see that the endodermis with the Casparian strip is here. The pericycle is just interior to that. Same with the monocot root. You have the pericycle right interior to the endodermis. Okay. Now the dicot root cross-section and the monocot root cross-section. Okay, this is the same image, but this is what it came up with, the text. So a dicot root cross-section often has its xylem in the form of a cross-shaped or four-armed structure, all right? So generally there could be anywhere between 2 or 3 or 4 arms or more arms, depending on the individual plant, okay? And between the arms of the xylem, you have the phloem between the arms of the xylem. Okay, remember the xylem conducts water and minerals and the phloem conducts food or sugar. Okay, that's the way that the vascular cylinder is arranged, okay, inside of the dicot. Now a monocot root, on the other hand, has its xylem cells spaced apart from each other with the phloem between the individual xylem cells. Okay, so this is like the vascular cylinder of a monocot root. Now we also have specialized roots, okay, such as food storage roots. Okay, what they'll do is they'll store starches and sugars. Okay, and some examples of this are sweet potato, yam, okay, in more tropical regions and subtropics, and carrots, beets, turnips, and radishes. Okay, so we're going to go back to the stand here. Okay, here we go. Here we have some storage roots. Okay, first of all, we have a radish. Okay, radish. Actually, I wanted to show you this first because this actually shows almost the whole plant. Okay, it shows that the root actually holds on to food. Okay, food is stored there. Food is actually made through photosynthesis by the leaves. Okay, and is stored in the root. So our radishes, like carrots, are biennials. They live their life cycle over 2 seasons. Okay, so what they'll do is that they'll germinate from the seed, and then they'll grow, and then they'll put out their leaves, start photosynthesizing, okay? Start photosynthesizing, and then they're sending sugar and other carbohydrates down into the roots where it's stored as starches in some cases, and in some cases, such as sugar beets, it's stored as sugar, okay, sucrose, right? So what they'll do is that they'll overwinter, and then the top part of it will die over the winter because these are cold season crops. And then what they'll do is they'll rest over the winter, then come spring, they'll send up new leaves, and then the food reserves will be used to send up the new leaves and to send up an inflorescence or flower, okay? Flower stalk, right? Carrots are the same thing. I wanted to show a carrot because most people eat carrots, you know? And so a carrot is actually another, what do you call that? Another taproot, but here it's been swelled to become a storage root, okay? And the tip of it is actually stem. So the part of the top of the carrot is stem with the leaves coming off it. So we have to remember that even if it's food, it comes from plants. They actually come from plants, okay? Now the third example is more like a subtropical or tropical sort of example of a food storage root. And this, of course, is a sweet potato, okay, sweet potato. And here you can see that it's probably just full of carbohydrates, whether it's in starches or a form of sugar, both very delicious, right? All you have to do is bake or boil it, okay? Cut it into pieces. You can eat it just as it is. You don't have to put any sauce on it or anything. It's very good for you, okay? Anyway, so that's actually some storage roots, food storage roots. Okay, now back to the slides. There are not only food storage roots, but there's also water storage roots, such as the man root. Okay, so man roots can actually weigh up to 66 pounds. They store so much water. They live in the kind of yellow desert area of eastern Washington state. Okay. Other specialized roots include propagative roots. Okay. What you have is that on the root you'll have these adventitious buds. Okay, so what are adventitious buds? Think about it. Okay, because like adventitious roots are roots where you don't expect roots to grow, like from the stem. Adventitious buds are buds that appear in places other than stems. So these adventitious buds actually appear on the roots, and then they develop into suckers. Okay, and what these suckers are aerial stems. So you actually have these little keiki that develop from these adventitious buds. Okay, so you have roots that can do asexual reproduction. Remember, asexual, one parent. Okay, so cherries, apples, and pears, they all have these propagative roots. And more locally, ulu or breadfruit, ohia'i or mountain apple, and also walke or paper mulberry, they all form these little keiki from these suckers. They do the same thing. Okay. We also have specialized roots called pneumatophores. Okay, so these are spongy roots of plants that get inundated with water, especially in, let's see, like estuaries or in wetlands. Okay, these spongy roots actually get inundated with water, and water always has less oxygen than air does. Okay, so what they'll do is they'll allow gas exchange, between the root and the water. Okay, so spongy roots do gas exchange, and an example of a plant that does that is a black mangrove. Okay. Other specialized roots include aerial roots. Okay, we have the aerial roots of orchids that have velamen. Okay, so people used to believe that velamen was actually to help the roots swell and fill with water, but now they think that velamen roots actually allow for the prevention of the loss of water. Okay, prop roots such as the prop roots of corn support plant in the wind. Okay, other plants that have prop roots include hala and banyan, such as this plant here. Okay, and then we have photosynthetic roots, like many orchids have photosynthetic roots. If you see their epiphytic roots or aerial roots growing out of an orchid, oftentimes at the tip of it it'll be green, okay, or along the area of it, it's green, so it does photosynthesis. They've actually done studies where they've grown orchids, in pots, and they've allowed other orchids to let their roots crawl along the outside of the pots, and the ones that had their roots exposed to light actually grew better. They grew larger, they made bigger flowers or more flowers. Okay, so these photosynthetic roots really are something. Okay. Now there are also contractile roots. Okay, what they'll do is they'll pull the plant into the soil. Okay, so lily bulbs are famous for doing that. They'll pull the plant deeper and deeper into the soil every year as a bulb continues to progress. Okay, another plant that is famous for doing this contractile root pulling is dandelions. You know the way dandelions sort of look like, that there are only leaves sticking out of the ground, right? But that's because you have contractile roots. There's also buttress roots. Look at these magnificent buttress roots here. Okay, What they do is they lend stability to plants that grow in shallow, nutrient-poor tropical soils. Okay, because tropical soils are actually nutrient-poor. You might think that they're nutrient-rich because there are a lot of things decaying and decomposing around them, but because it's warm, because it's also wet, the microorganisms actually decompose the matter faster than plants can use them. So tropical soils tend to be poor soils in terms of nutrients. Okay, so because you have shallow roots, they actually need these buttress roots to maintain their stability. Aren't they beautiful? Look at that. Like ramparts. Okay, so tropical fig trees have buttress roots. Another kind of specialized roots are parasitic roots. Okay, these parasitic roots parasitize other plants. They'll actually send their haustoria, like a plug. It's a peg-like plug, peg-like projection that plugs into the phloem, the sugar-producing cells, and sometimes water-producing or conducting cells in the other plant. So this here is probably the parasitic plant root, okay, and this here is the host plant, okay. So daughter is one type of parasitic plant that we know in Hawaii. In Hawaii, we also know it as kaunaoa, okay. Another plant that you might not think is a parasite, but it's a hemiparasite because the leaves are green, so they do photosynthesis. Okay, but the iliahi or the sandalwood is a hemiparasite. It actually will grow better, grow bigger, grow stronger if it has a host to actually plug its haustoria into. Okay. Now we also have mycorrhizae. Mycorrhizae means fungus root. Okay. So what happens is that more than 3/4 of seed plants actually have mycorrhizae, and this is a mutualistic association between a fungus or fungi and the roots of different kinds of plant species. Okay, it's a mutualistic association because both parties benefit. The fungus gets sugars from the plant, also amino acids, okay, and the plant in its turn gets nutrients, okay, from the fungus, such as phosphorus. Okay, they find that plants that don't have a symbiotic relationship with mycorrhizae will sometimes be deficient in phosphorus, so they cannot take up phosphorus very well. Okay, so some plants that are well known for their mycorrhizal associations are orchids. The orchids need mycorrhizae, okay, because orchid seeds are very fine. They're like dust, all right? They have no endosperm or the nutritive tissue inside of the seed to sustain them. So they need to get infected by a fungus, and the fungus will then actually make food for the developing seed, and then the seed can actually swell up and green up and germinate and grow into protocorm-like bodies or protocorms, okay, and that develops into the orchid plant, okay. Other plants that benefit from this mutualistic association are native Hawaiian plants. I can't think of a single native Hawaiian plant that doesn't have some associated fungus that it needs in order to grow optimally, okay. Now we also have root nodules as being some kind of root adaptation. So 80% of our atmosphere, you know, the air or the gases in the atmosphere, is nitrogen gas, okay? But this is a form of nitrogen that plants cannot use, okay? So in these root nodules, there live bacteria, and these bacteria, rhizobium, they will actually convert atmospheric nitrogen into a form usable by plants, okay? This happens in the legumes or in the plant family Fabaceae, okay? Here you can see some root nodules on these roots. Okay, and in here is where the rhizobium or the symbiotic bacteria live, okay? So beans, peas, alfalfa, and clovers Okay, these are all different kind of legumes or members of the Fabaceae. Okay, so why would nitrogen be important? Okay, think about it. Why would nitrogen be important to the plant? In terms of fertilizer, fertilizer, chemical fertilizer generally, they talk about NPK, the amount of nitrogen, the amount of phosphorus, the amount of potassium. Those are the three main nutrients for plants that are given to them through fertilizers. So why is nitrogen so important? Think about it. Okay? Have you thought about it? Have you thought about it? Well, remember amino acids? Amino acids are components of proteins, right? So plants need nitrogen for proteins, also for nucleic acids. Remember, the proteins are made up of strings of amino acids, polypeptides, right? And the amino acids actually have an amino group, right? A carboxyl group, an amino group, a hydrogen, and an R group connected to a central carbon. So the amino group has a nitrogen in it. So plants need nitrogen for proteins. And nitrogen is also a component of a nitrogenous base for DNA and RNA as well. Okay, very important. Okay, now human uses. Okay, food, of course. So biennials, such as beets, turnips, and carrots, have been important, okay, food sources to human beings since prehistoric times. Okay, carrots in the form that we know of today have been around for at least 2,000 years. I think carrots used to be black or purple before, okay, but some mutation arose so they became orange, and of course we know orange carrots as the carrot type. Now we have perennials, such as sweet potatoes, as you see here, yams, and cassava. Okay. Roots also are sources of spices, such as sassafras, sarsaparilla, licorice, and angelica. These all come from different plant roots. Okay, drugs, such as aconite, which is used in liniments. Okay, ipecac, which is used as an expectorant. It kind of is used to make you vomit, right? And it's an emetic. Okay, gentian is a tonic, and reciprine is a tranquilizer. Reciprine comes from the snakeroot plant. Okay, also insecticides such as rotenone. Rotenone comes from the barbasco plant and has been used by South American natives for fish killing. What they'll do is they'll get a piece of the root and smash it up, throw it in the water, and the fish will get stunned. Okay, so it actually stuns the fish, but it in no way hurts the humans who eat the fish. Okay? In Hawaii, we also had fish poisoning plants too, but they were different plants. Okay? Now we get into the topic of soils. Okay? Soils are dynamic. They're complex and they're constantly changing. Okay? They're made up of the topsoil, which is the upper layer down to about 4 to 8 inches. Okay? And the top layer of the topsoil is called the A horizon. The bottom layer of the topsoil is called the E horizon. Okay? Then we have the subsoil underneath that, which is the B horizon that extends 1 to 3 feet deeper into the earth. And then we have the parent material, okay, or the C horizon. Okay, so the C horizon extends to bedrock. Okay, it accumulates to the weathering of rock. Okay, whether the rock is igneous rock or a result of volcanic action, or sedimentary rock, which is rock that actually forms from sediments, okay, usually through water, or metamorphic rock, which is either igneous or sedimentary rock that has been changed through pressure and heat and time. Okay. So soil texture. Okay. That's the properties of sand, silt, and clay. Okay, so sand tends to be the largest particles, particle size about 50 micrometers to 2 millimeters. That's a big difference. Okay, remember a micrometer is 1/1000th of a millimeter. Okay, silt particles tend to be a little smaller. Okay, they go from 2 micrometers to 50 micrometers, and clay are the smallest of all. They're all less than 2 micrometers large, the particle size. Okay. So the best agricultural soils are loams, all right? They're made of sand, clay, and organic matter. Okay. The best soil is about 40% sand, 40% silt, and 20% clay. All right. Now light soils have a high sand, low clay proportion. Okay. Heavy soils have high clay. Okay. Coarse soils are soils that are porous and that don't hold water. And clay are soils with high water, okay, that allow little water to pass through. Okay, so you have light soils, heavy soils, coarse soils, and clay soils. Okay. Now in terms of water in soil, okay, we have hygroscopic water, which is bound to the soil, and this kind of water is unavailable to plants, okay, because it's bound to the soil chemically. Then there's gravitational water, which usually drains after a rain, okay, but if you have poor drainage, that can lead to interfering with plant growth, because plants need to have good drainage to their soils, even though they also need water. Okay. Now capillary water, okay, is water held in the soil against the force of gravity. Okay, they're held in the pores of the soil, and this is the kind of water that plants are mainly dependent upon. Okay. Now soil pH affects soil and plants. Like cranberries thrive in acidic soils, okay? But if you have very high or low pH, it can be toxic because the mycorrhizae die. Remember, we just talked about the fact that mycorrhizae are important for many plants to actually live and survive. A lot of plants need their mycorrhizae, so if their mycorrhizae die, the plants will die, okay? Also, high or low pH can also affect the nutrient availability. Okay, low pH can inhibit nitrogen-fixing bacteria, so there goes your nitrogen, right? And high pH makes copper, iron, and manganese less available. Okay, so you can have a plant that looks a little sickly, okay, because it either doesn't have nutrients available to it, whether it's nitrogen, in the case of low pH soils, or copper or iron or manganese in high pH soils or alkaline soils. Okay, so what do we do about this? We can treat acid soils with liming. What does that mean is that you add compounds of calcium or magnesium, okay? And you can treat alkalinity by adding sulfur. The sulfur becomes sulfuric acid in the soil, or you can add nitrogen fertilizers, okay? Okay, so now let's do a review, okay? We talked about our apical meristems, tips of roots and tips of shoots, lateral meristems, which are in cylinders, in a sideways direction they expand. Okay, we talked about xylem, the water conducting tissue in the plant, and phloem, the food conducting tissue in the plant. We talked about other tissues such as secretory tissues. Okay, we talked about the functions of roots and also the forms of roots. We talked about the regions of roots, the root anatomy, right? The root cap, the area of cell division, the region of cell elongation, the region of maturation. Okay. We talked about specialized roots. We talked about uses of roots. We talked about agricultural soil. We talked about soil particles, water, and pH. Okay, that's all we have for you today. Okay, I hope that we haven't overloaded you too much with too much information. Hope it was just right. Okay, so we'll see you next time. Have a good day, have a good evening, have a good week, and aloha.